questions. So tonight's moderator is my friend and colleague, Karla Fackler Grafton. And as many of you know, Carla is the assistant librarian at the John P. Webster Library. And like many people on our staff and in ministry in general, she is a woman with many hidden secret superpowers. And one of them is that she's has a degree in Old Testament scholarship. And she's just an amazing colleague. And I'm really pleased that she agreed to moderate tonight's discussion. And she's going to go ahead and introduce our panelists tonight. So Carla, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll be doing the tech. If anyone has questions, you can chat me privately or just put it in the chat link. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Sure.
Thank you. And thank you all for being with us this evening. I hope that you have all had a chance to visit the art exhibit which inspired our gathering, which Jennifer talked about, called Abraham Out of One Many, which is at the Chase Family Gallery of the Mandell JCC. If you haven't seen it yet, I strongly encourage you to take the time to do so. This exhibit focuses on what we can learn from Abraham's story about living together more harmoniously. For this exhibition, 3 celebrated Middle Eastern contemporary visual artists from the faith traditions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism each created 5 paintings that interpret Abraham's life and faith journey for us today, serving as a guide toward creating cultures of peace, harmony, justice, and healing, all as descendants of a shared heritage. I'm going to put a link to Caravan, which is the organization that curated this exhibit, in the chat if you want to find out more about them. Tonight, we'll be looking at the stories of Hagar, Sarah, and Abraham within the faith traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The stories around the intersection of these 3 people and their children, Ishmael and Isaac, are important to all 3 of these faith traditions and have influenced how people of these faiths have interacted with one another. Thus, the more we can listen to each other, learn from each other, and work to understand each other's stories and perspectives, the better we will be able to work together for a just peace in our world. While I introduce our 3 panelists for this evening, Jennifer will put up a quick poll question. We're interested in finding out about how much you already might know about Hagar and Sarah. I'm delighted to welcome our 3 panelists for this evening: Rabbi Andi Fliegel, the Reverend Dr. Barbara Headley, and Chaplain Aida Mansoor. Rabbi Andi Fliegel is the Associate Rabbi of Congregation Beth Israel in West Hartford. She was ordained in 2016 by the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, where she earned master's degrees in both Hebrew literature and religious education. Welcome, Rabbi Fliegel. The Reverend Dr. Barbara Headley is the pastor of Zion Community Baptist Church in Springfield, Massachusetts. She served as assistant dean and director of degree programs at the Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, formerly Hartford Seminary, where she was also an adjunct instructor and on the board of trustees. She has also served as an adjunct instructor of leadership in ministry at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and as an adjunct instructor of women in leadership at Bay Path University in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. Welcome, Dr. Headley. Chaplain Aida Mansoor is the Director of Field Education at Hartford International University. She also serves in the community and works with the Muslim Coalition of Connecticut and the Islamic Association of Greater Hartford. Welcome, Chaplain Mansoor. Each of our panelists is going to take a few minutes now to tell us about Hagar and Sarah and Abraham in their respective faith traditions. And then we'll move on from there to questions. So please put any questions you have in the chat. So Andi, are you willing to go first and tell us a bit about what you learned about the intersection of the stories of Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah when you were young, and maybe a little bit about how you teach about them today?
I am happy to, and I'm glad to be here with everyone. I'll begin with how I learned about Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar as a child, with the brief disclaimer that this is a focus on the intersection of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. There are many teachings, and there's a lot of focus, certainly in Jewish education, on stories of Abraham and Sarah, but we're going to specifically zoom in tonight on the intersection between these three important people in all of our traditions, and I will refer to it as Torah or the Hebrew Bible. So there's a lot more text than we can look at together from Torah about Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. So here are some excerpts that I think give we're going to look at two different parts from Genesis 16 and Genesis 18 that I think really capture how I learned about these three characters as a child. So Sarai and Abram, they're referred to as Sarai and Abram here because this is before their name change to Sarah and Abraham. Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Look, the Eternal has kept me from bearing. Consort with my maid. Perhaps I shall have a son through her." And Abram heeded Sarai's request. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took her maid Hagar the Egyptian, after Abram had dealt in the land of Canaan for 10 years, and gave her to her husband Abram as concubine. He cohabitated with Hagar, and she conceived. We have, now I'm going to be going in a little bit in and out. I admit some of the things I'm going to say now are not things that I learned as a child, but this feels like the relevant moment to share them. So this is the big focus, really. The way I learned about Hagar as a child is that Sarah and Abraham are trying to have a child. They haven't been able to for years and years and years. And so Hagar is the one who is able to enable them to have a child. I learned later in life that there is evidence of this practice as being common in the ancient world. We have evidence from Newsy, from Hammurabi's Code, that a slave of the primary wife could be in exactly as it's described here, given over to the husband in order for them to have a child together if they aren't able to conceive. So the next focus of this learning comes fast forwarding 2 chapters to Genesis 18. Sorry about that. Sarai, wrong slide. So then one said in Genesis 18, then one said, "I will return to you next year, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." So this is an angel, a messenger from God talking to Abraham. Now they've had the name change. "And Sarah shall have a son." Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. Sarah had stopped having the periods of women. We're meant to understand that she's 90 years old. And so, not surprisingly, for a 90-year-old woman finding out she's going to bear a child, and Sarah laughed inwardly, saying, "Now that I am withered, am I to have enjoyment with my husband so old?" Then the Eternal said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, 'Shall I in truth bear a child, old as I am?' Is anything too wondrous for the Eternal? I will return to you at the time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." Sarah lied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was frightened. But God replied, "You did laugh." God here is in brackets because it's not actually completely clear that God is the one who makes the response. It could, in fact, be Abraham. Most translators will translate this as God, but there are some scholars who wonder if this could be Abraham's voice instead. So this really, I would say, captures what I learned about about Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah as a child. One addition would be that Hagar's son Ishmael, who she is told in between these two chapters, will have many descendants and have his own nation, which ultimately becomes Islam. That is something, what a cool fact, what a cool thing to have included in our Torah is not the storyline that we follow, the genesis of this people, but that its beginnings and origins are contained in part of our stories as well. So moving on to what I've learned since and how I like to teach this text, although there are always so many very different ways. One is confronting what happens in Genesis 16, just after Hagar conceives. Now we're going backwards in the text this comes right after the first passage I initially read. He, being Abraham, cohabitated with Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was lowered in her esteem. And Sarai said to Abram, "The wrong done me is your fault. I myself put my maid in your bosom. Now that she sees that she is pregnant, I am lowered in her esteem. The Eternal decide between you and me." Abram said to Sarai, "Your maid is in your hands. Deal with her as you think right." Then Sarai treated her harshly, and she ran away from her. So since in my adulthood, I have to confront how painful this encounter is, where Sarai treats Hagar harshly, and Hagar is so desperate and so pained as a pregnant woman. She leaves the only home that she has, going off into the unknown. She leaves the camp, the symbol of danger in the ancient world, because of the abuse and harsh treatment that she is experiencing. And then much later in Genesis 21, Hagar, who leaves and then will be sent back from God and has her child, her son Ishmael, after hearing the promise that he will be a great nation in his own right. Now Sarah too has a child. Genesis 18 has happened. She's already laughed and found out she will become pregnant. And now Isaac has been born, and Sarah saw the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had born to Abraham, mitzachek. That's the verb here. There is so much uncertainty about what this means in this context. What was Ishmael doing with Isaac together in this moment? What does mitzachek mean? It could mean simply playing. Mitzachek is the same word used for laughing. Isaac, Yitzchak, this is all connected. Were they simply laughing and playing together? Or like Isaac, Yitzchak was given his name for this word, this moment of laughter that Sarah had. Could it be that Ishmael was Isaaking himself, that Sarah saw him taking on a role she was uncomfortable with, much like we heard before we started talking, out of fear for her son's position? She said to Abraham, "Cast out that slave woman and her son, for the son of that slave shall not share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." The matter distressed Abraham greatly, for it concerned a son of his. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed over the boy or your slave. Whatever Sarah tells you to do, do as she says, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be continued for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him too, for he is your seed." Early next morning, Abraham took some bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He placed them over her shoulder together with the child and sent her away, and she wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. I have so much more to say, but I have, I think, about 30 seconds. So I want to lift up, I think, just two last points, and I know we'll have more time to talk later and learn from our other scholars here as well. One is that in these really painful moments where we follow Hagar outside of the camp, the first time on her own as a pregnant woman, and the second time just after this encounter with Ishmael himself, where he nearly dies and God responds to his voice. We are following a non-Israelite story, which is very unusual in Torah. And one of the lessons I've learned from one of my teachers is that it seems to be very purposeful here, that the stories that come before and after these encounters are focused on covenant, meaning how Abraham and Sarah have this promise of, through following the line of Isaac, of the great nation that they will create in this specific land. And then sandwiched in there is the story of Hagar. Ha is the, and gar is the word ger, the stranger. Her name literally means the stranger. We follow very sympathetically and painfully the story of her being cast out and mistreated by our heroes in our Torah story. And it is meant for us to sit in that discomfort and that pain and question ourselves when we are the ones with power and privilege. How will we interact with, lift up, or mistreat those who do not have it? So I'm going to skip ahead to just my last slide here. Oh gosh, this is from Hagar's first moment in the desert. This just has to be said. I'm sure someone else is going to say it, but this incredible moment where Hagar says, "You are El Roi." She names God. This is an incredibly empowering moment. Hagar, a non-Israelite woman, actually gives God a name that did not exist for God before in this context. She, Hagar, is also the only one who is promised, a promise comes to a woman about how numerous her progeny will be through her son. In every other instance, this comes from a man. This is my last slide for our opening presentation. It's a poem called Sarah and Hagar by Linda Hirschhorn. I am calling you, O Sarah. This is your sister Hagar, calling through the centuries to reach you from afar. Oh yes, I am your Sarah. I remember you, Hagar. Your voice comes through the distance, a cry upon my heart. It also breaks my heart seeing this in a text written by a man, the potential of a relationship between two women that is painfully not supportive. And we can imagine and dream through in our conversations tonight and in the modern texts that we write, a different story moving forward for these two women.
Thank you, Andi. Wow, you gave us a lot to think about. Wow, we appreciate that.
I'm
Barbara,
sorry I went over time.
No worries. That's okay. Barbara, are you ready to go next?
I am. So I guess I can read the scripture now and then begin to talk to you about the appropriation of this text from a Christian womanist perspective. Okay, so she has that up there and I have that here. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now she knows she's pregnant. She despises me. But the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord, thank you, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road of Shur. And he said to her, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It's still there between Kadesh and Beereh. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she bore. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Okay, as we would say at home, first reading of the Word of God. I like to start the way Black persons who read the text and descendants of a culture in Africa or from the continent would identify ourselves in connection to community. And so I would have to say that I am the second daughter of West Indian immigrants who came to this country. Who had a religious background of having been part of the colony state of the West Indies by Great Britain, England. And so they were raised in the Anglican setting. I was raised in that setting as well. When they came to the United States, we were born here. We became Episcopalians. And it wasn't until my own experience, my own personal experience, that I became a Baptist, and that connection for me, having been raised up in the Episcopal Church and going through all of the rituals and the acts that's involved in that. What became important for me as I came into my own in college was the history behind the African American church and its appropriation of biblical texts. So not only did I have my own personal experience, and then began to observe particularly the free, independent, traditional African American churches and that tradition of Black religion and how it appropriates biblical texts. Knowing these stories from a child, but hearing it with a different perspective. And so that's very important, because I think while we all are here and my colleagues are talking about how we appropriate the biblical text, and we've heard from the Jewish perspective from Rabbi Andi and will soon from Aida. And I think what I want to come to say is that the text that I just read, how it is appropriated, taught, and realized comes from a cultural perspective, and which is very important. It's given risen to, at some point, being able to hear scriptural texts that have been handed down to African Americans in particular, former descendants of former slaves, to understand that we have always, the fact that we can even claim to be Christians in a religion that has been so scattered with racist and oppressive ways in which it has been used to oppress people, is a wonder. Many of our younger generations cannot even understand why we would, even as older generations, even cling to it. But we have the capacity to not only hear that text and hear it, and many times it was taught to us in the traditional male-dominated Western European construct of it. But we've always been able to hear, as an oppressed people, hear biblical texts with almost a third ear. And that's so important because when I went through seminary, and many of the scholars who were birthing womanist theology were either my teachers or my TAs, and Dolores Williams, all of them, I knew all of them when I was coming up, and knew that they were telling us, we're hearing something. Do you hear something different in this text? So let me just tell you what that means. On Mother's Day in 2017, I took this text to give my Mother's Day message, and that's not unusual for me, and it doesn't cause me to wonder why would you use that text, because whenever I read the stories of women in the Bible, I'm always listening from the ear of a Black female descendant of immigrants, descendants of former slaves, descendants of those who can hear this text. And I hear, whereas people will take the major themes that are always taught concerning the biblical text, I listen to the extra cast members of the story that are never giving any credit. And so for me to give a Mother's Day sermon around Hagar was the same as for me when I would preach about Keturah, Moses's dark-skinned wife, or Rahab, or Leah, or the Syrophoenician woman, all women who are outside of the promise of Israel and yet are integral to the story. And that's how, as a clergy person for the traditional African American church, it's very important for me and to share a womanist perspective on this. And to know, womanist perspective was birthed after Black liberation theology, where African Americans, people of color, begin to take credit or begin to understand that their understanding of the biblical text is credible. It's worthy of recognition and even to be established as a form of theology. And so to be able to understand that, particularly, as I said before, in the history of America and also in England in the early years of slavery, the evangelization of enslaved Africans was fought against, because they thought if they gave them the Bible, if they evangelized them, if they witnessed and became Christian, and they became baptized, the white enslavers and colonizers worried that would make them equal. And so there was a great debate early on, and during slavery, about whether or not you would even use the Bible to evangelize. But in the attempt to justify enslavement, it was often said, well, if we give them the Bible, that's one of the reasons why we're helping them by bringing them out from the darkness of Africa and giving them the Christian faith. And so it was given, but we know also through slave narratives and the history that has been captured from the years of slavery here in the United States, only certain scriptures were ever taught, only certain ways in which the Bible was taught to keep slaves docile and knowing that you ought to obey your master. But there's something about the sacred text that once it is released, the enslaved, the oppressed, the marginalized have the capacity to hear in those stories of the Israelites on the promise that there is a God who liberates those who are enslaved. And so to come to this text was very meaningful for me to hear the story of Hagar. And the reason why I wanted to use it at that Mother's Day, it was a time that we were talking about in our communities, the devastation of our communities, what's happening to our young people, what's happening to African Americans, the police brutality, all of that. And the title of my sermon was, Mother, God Hears You. Mother, God Hears You. And to say that in the context of my religious experience and church and community means a lot, because from a woman's perspective, we're always listening in midst of our community. A woman's perspective is it's an approach to the wholeness of the community, the wholeness of women, the wholeness, it's from a woman's perspective of who God is. And what is traditional in our faith as Black Christians is that for many years as a child, I've heard my mother, my grandmother talk about God will make a way somehow. And for me to understand it and grow into my understanding about that, that's what Hagar experienced. That God, she was not the promised one. She did not the line of the promise, but her experience with God speaks to the women who are the oppressed, who are the marginalized. That God makes, we may not be the one who is a primary chosen, but we're in the story. We're in the story, and God makes a way for us. One of the reasons why this story was important to me is because I am the daughter and the granddaughter of women who did domestic work. And that's important. I mean, I've been blessed because of their struggles and their perseverance to advance in education, to have a doctorate, to have multiple, 2 different vocations. But I understand, and I knew what it was when my mother was a domestic. And so when I read this story about Hagar, I know that, and I use cultural interpretation based on our experiences. It causes me to ask a lot of questions. It causes me to ask a lot of questions because Hagar's story, as we have it in this text, is a story of slavery, poverty, ethnicity, sexual and economic exploitation, surrogacy, domestic violence, homelessness, single parenting, and it is also, though, a story of deep abiding faith that in a God who makes a way somehow, even while moving towards fulfilling the promise of a people who will be to be the light of the world. And so the story for me has a lot of implications, and to take it apart, to understand the dynamics, we're as women of color, as we listen to this, and African American women in particular, as we listen to this, we hear the dynamic between Abram, Sarai, and Hagar. Now, as Andi has shared with us, that even the fact that Sarah would even suggest that Abram should go into Hagar, her servant, that might have been part of the culture of Mesopotamia, that whole business about having someone who was a higher station to be able to use someone in their household to fulfill their progeny dreams. But hearing that has to bring back to my memory the kinds of injustices that go on with the whole industry and the whole culture that we are developing very much of surrogacy. And nowhere in there do we ever get a sense that Abram and Sarai make this decision. Who asked Hagar the use of her body? And that says a lot to me in terms of women of color whose bodies are cheapened and abused and exploited in our culture to this day. And who has control over our bodies? So that's one thing. And to the fact that she does conceive, and her relationship with Sarai changes. Sarah is hoping that she will have a child, and you need to understand this too. What this rings in the historical consciousness of descendants of slaves. It brings close to mind to us that we very much in part of our culture, our ancestors, our mothers, our great-great-grandmothers were raped, were abused by masters and overseers, sometimes just to increase the population of slavery. They had no control over the children that they bore, and that even with slave masters who had children with their slaves, those children were not even considered their children. They were slaves. They were property. They were economic gains for them. And so for us to read this happening to Hagar, it has to trigger generational trauma for women of color to read this in this story, to read that happened to her, and she has no say. But the other piece about it too is particularly the story that we have, the excerpt we have here, the pericope we have here, is that when when Sarah's upset because she finally has her own child, or no, this is before, that's in 21. In 16, when when Hagar gets pregnant, she this downtrodden slave got a sense of, look what I can do. Even my mistress can't do this. So there was some agitation there. But the thing about it, Abraham just turned it over back to his wife, and there was hostilities. And what we don't talk about many times is the hostilities between women of color and white women. Even when we are attempting to be in community together. Historically, if you look through the feminist movement, where some African American women got involved in that, there was a separating of the tides at some point, because white feminists at some point thought it was more advantageous for them to really negate the vote for Black women in order that they might get ultimately what they wanted. So there's history behind that. There's history about how that, even to the point, it's simple in my own experience as a child, to have the white women in whose home my mother cleaned would call our home and ask for Cynthia. And I, as a child, I could have been 7, 8, 9 years old. I was offended that someone called my mother by her first name. And I would say, you mean Miss Headley, Mrs. Headley? And that dynamic to me just really says something about that we don't really want to talk about, but that we really should, because there is many times animosity. We might think that all women should be fighting for the same things, but there was a parting of the waves many times when it comes to Black women and white women in what they need and understanding of in terms of patriarchy. And so I'm going to stop here, but Hagar's story and the promise of Ishmael is a promise for women of color who have struggled, who are still struggling with their children, their sons in particular. And that's what I brought out at this Mother's Day statement, is that this she's promised that Ishmael will be a great nation. He's going to be hard to get along with. He's going to be and when I just speak to these mothers whose children are incarcerated, whose children get poor education and everything else, I had to say, but you have a promise too. And God sees you. And we say that from the women's perspective, and that we appropriate a cultural community understanding of the text that has not been heard before. And that's what we bring to it.
Thank you, Barbara. I wish we had more time. I know there will be questions for you specifically on those issues. Thank you again. And now, Ida, we hope to hear from you how the stories of Hagar and Sarah and Abraham are taught and learned in Islam.
Sure. So for me, there's one real reference to Hagar in the Quran, and basically I'll just read the first line. It says, "Indeed, Safa and Marwa are among the symbols of God," and that's really referring to Hagar. But let me go back in time a little and tell you a story. Consider, if you will, a couple making a journey, a rather long journey. After a few hours, quite a few hours of travel, they come to this bleak area, rocky and unwelcoming, with no one in sight, not one person as far as the eye can see. The person you love and trust turns to you and says he's going to leave you in this terrible place and go back home. Now, I have to say, if my husband Reza did that to me, I wouldn't react very well. Especially if I had a baby with me and he was planning to leave me and the baby in this desolate place with just a small bag of dates and a little flask of water. This basically was the experience of Hagar, or as we call her, Hajara, peace be upon her. And we call her Hajra, and this is how we understand it. Unlike me, however, she turned to her husband Abraham and asked if this was God's will. And when he said it was, she knew that she and her baby, would be fine and God would look after them. In Islam, Hajra, peace be upon her, is celebrated as an example of someone who truly believed and relied on the one God. Abraham, peace be upon him, Muslims believe, is instructed by God to leave Hajra and their son Ishmael in this barren, desolate, unwelcoming terrain. Once Abraham leaves and all the food and water she has is finished, she decides to run up the first hill she sees, and it's called Safa. And if you see in the picture, right in the center, this is a place that we actually go to for Hajj. So you can see that middle bit. So she runs up to Safa, and when she sees nobody up on that hill, she runs back to another hill called Marwa, and again sees no one. She runs back and forth. Actually, she walks briskly back and forth between these two hills, and on her seventh run, the baby stops crying. And fearing that he has died, she runs to him and sees a spring of water at the baby's feet. The terrain to this day is so rocky and dry, a water supply has to be a miracle. Narrations narrate that it is thought that Angel Gabriel descended from the heavens and nudged the land under baby Ismail's feet with his wing, so that water sprung forth, and to this day, we drink from the well of Zamzam when we go on pilgrimage to Mecca. One really amazing thing to remember in terms of empowerment, women's empowerment, was that Hajra, a woman of color, is remembered by every pilgrim, every woman, and I think more importantly, every man, men and women, remembering her when they are walking, or rather walking briskly, in her footsteps, back and forth 7 times to reenact her experience. And then, of course, drinking from the well of Zamzam as she did. Billions of people celebrate the life of this amazing woman for her strong belief in God under the stress of being abandoned by someone she loved and trusted. In her anguish, she turns to God, and God blesses her for her faith and for her effort. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the slide that's up here. So on the right, the top right, you'll see a picture of a cube, and that is called the Kaaba. It means actually cube in Arabic. It was actually constructed, we believe, or rather reconstructed by Abraham and his son Ishmael. And if you look at the right, there's this kind of map of the place, so that you can see a little cube in the middle where the Kaaba is. But you can also see the orangey yellowish part, and it says Safa at the bottom and Marwa at the top. I don't know if you can see that. So this is the place where we run between these two hills back and forth. And I have to say, in terms of learning about Abraham, as a Muslim, really the 5th pillar in terms of going for the pilgrimage is basically a lot of people by experience, but also by, sort of learning about the pilgrimage. It's all about Abraham and his family. People sometimes think, oh, the Hajj is about the Prophet Muhammad, right? And it's not. It's all about Abraham, which is pretty cool. The picture in the middle shows people starting at Safa, and they walk, sort of towards Marwa, and they come back and they do this 7 times, like, I told you, like she did. And then there's this amazing, drink that you get at the end of it from the well of Zamzam. And it's really interesting. I wonder if we can just put the slide off for a second so I can show you a few things. So I actually brought this. It's really interesting how, when we go for Hajj, we come back with 2 things. So of course, pre-COVID, we were able to go. And actually just in January, just before COVID began, we made this pilgrimage. We took some youth from our mosque and we went to Mecca, which was a really incredible experience for me. And coming back, it was quite funny because with us, we brought, and I'll just show you what this is. This is a bottle of Zamzam, right? And of course, customs, I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that, Zamzam? Customs were saying, you know, we do have water in America. You know that, right? But this is the water from which the spring of Hagar started the spring, and so it's very special to us. But it's so funny that the customers looked at us and thought, these people are crazy. They're bringing gallons of this water back to the States. But we consider it as like a holy thing. The interesting thing about the story of Hagar, when Abraham turns his back to her in the Quran, it says that Abraham made a supplication to God, and he basically asked God to make the place where he was leaving Hagar into a safe place. And this is actually a quote from the Quran. He said, "Our Lord, I have settled some of my offspring in an uncultivated valley close to your sacred house, Lord." And he says, "Let them keep up prayer and make people's hearts turn to them and provide them with produce so that they can be thankful. Our Lord, you know well what we conceal and what we reveal. Nothing at all is hidden from God on earth or in heaven. Praise be to God who has granted me both Ishmael and Isaac in my old age. My Lord hears all requests. Lord, grant that I and my offspring may keep up prayer. Our Lord, accept my request. Our Lord, forgive me, my parents, and the believers on the day of judgment." So he's basically making a supplication for the children of Ishmael and the children of Isaac. And I thought this was such a beautiful thing in terms of bringing these two populations together. And I was told by my colleague, Dina Grant, who teaches Judaic studies at HIU, about how in the Bible it says how Ishmael and Isaac came together to bury their father, Abraham. And so I thought that was like just such a beautiful part in terms of bringing these two individuals together. Rabbi Andi mentioned the part where Sarah laughed, and it's found actually in the Quran as well. I'll just read you that part just so you know that there's some similarity. So it talks about Abraham, and then it says, his wife was standing nearby and laughed. We gave her good news of Isaac, and after him of Jacob. She said, alas for me, how am I to bear a child when I am an old woman, and my husband here is an old man? That would be a strange thing. They, and we think they is the angels, they said, are you astonished at what God ordains? The grace of God and his blessings be upon you, people of this house, for he is worthy of all praise and glory. So I thought that that's a really sort of interesting, sort of comparison to Genesis 18, which I thought was really, sort of amazing. And I like to see these similarities and these comparisons. So I will end there. There's so much more to talk about, but I think I'd love to hear your questions and let's get into it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aida. Thank you so much. And thank you, all of you. That was great. As we're waiting for questions to come in the chat, I was wondering if any of you have any comments or questions for each other.
I can say that in our preparation for this, and also then hearing from Andi tonight, it was just powerful for us to realize in our sacred text with the Quran and with the Hebrew Bible and with the Bible that the Christians hold to, that our stories have twists to them as they're told in our own traditions. And I learned a couple weeks ago during the Hagar as a model of faith, continuing these kinds of things, the scholars kind of took that apart, and we're supposed to be the practitioners tonight talking about it. But that was interesting to me, particularly to hear how and Andi started to touch on that tonight about the different the rabbinic translations are stories that are added to this story of Hagar that is part of your tradition. And then to learn Aida's tradition of Hagar totally, because I'm not that familiar with the Quran and the historical of what you do during your Hajj, it was just powerful to me to hear how it's appropriated in all of our cultures, but also to know that our reading of the text does not negate or is not a close. Each culture and each faith has additional ways in which we look at the text.
I'm wondering, so Phyllis Tribble and Letty Russell in their book, Hagar, Sarah, and Their Children, they ask, how can we as children of Hagar and Sarah contribute to the topics of family, faith, and interfaith relations? I'm wondering if any of you have a comment on that. Anyone want to start?
I was drawn, and I said it before, but I was drawn by the fact that Isaac and Ishmael came together. And I think that these were the children of these two women, and they came together. And so that's what I take from that story. I think that, I'm hopeful that, if they can do it, we can do it.
I think I would say—
This is Molly again, and I'm writing a memoir. And my daughter-in-law asked me in the memoir to focus on, if I had all the money in the world, what would I do? And my answer is, I would bring all the mothers and grandmothers together, and we would solve the climate situation. Because we are the bearers of the children. We're also the ones whose responsibility it has always been to keep the species alive. And I know we value our kids and our grandkids each alike. And for me, it would not, the religion, the geography, it would not be an issue. Because this is, the guys don't want to admit that, but we are evolved from this very planet, just like everything else. And for us to think that we have the right to destroy this creation of God for greed or to be number one, I would just like to bring the women together and let's get beyond the politics, because there's not going to be anything worth living on or with if we don't get over this. There is no being number one. Who cares? I don't care. I just want my grandkids to have a decent place to thrive and to survive. And I wish we could do that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Barbara, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I did. In theory, that sounds really good, and that should be the direction that we go. But when any mother, something you said that I don't see really play out in our lives here in America or other places, is that mothers are the core. We carry the culture. We carry the traditions and things like that. But many times it's mothers who are primarily seeking the survival of their progeny, their children. Until we feel like a mother in Africa or a mother in Iran or Afghanistan and her children have just as much right to as much of this planet as people in first world.
I totally agree, Barbara. I don't care what their religion is.
Can I finish? Can I finish, please? Thank you. And so we say it, but we really don't do it. When you think about, just go back in the history of this country in terms of civil rights, when you see pictures of white women screaming at little Black children going to school in Little Rock, what does that say? They don't want their children to be educated. And so it's one thing to want that and desire that. The desire of this, I think, and I will tag into what Ida said at the end, to hear that Ishmael and Isaac came together. That's not to say we knew what their mothers were both gone at that point. Okay, who I don't know about Hagar, but and so, but there is something to hope that our children will move from our own prejudices, and I see that happening in the younger generation in this country. And that's why so many of their elders are so upset, because they're moving beyond where we were stuck. And so it's one thing to desire it, but it has to be consciously, because I myself experience where sometimes as women, we think we have all things in common, but until we really address our own prejudices, we will not ever be together and one on anything, even as women.
There's a question in the chat that I want to address to Andy. They say in the Torah, Hagar is given as wife, is not as a status of a slave. She's equal to Sarah. If that's true, then why is she looked down on by Sarah? I think they're getting at the idea that that Hagar was given, some translations anyway say given as his wife. Do you have any comments on that, Andy?
So her status is elevated in that exchange. I think we can call it that. But she is not seen as equal to Sarah. Sarah still has the primary position in the family. And when we look at those other ancient civilizations, their neighbors who also have this practice, the practice was for the wife to give their slave to the husband to have a child that would then belong to the wife. That would then be, so, and she says this, I'll have a child through her. So yes, and perhaps we even see that reflected in the text when Hagar says that Sarai was lowered in her esteem, that in her own perhaps her own elevated status is partially reflected there, but it's not equal to Sarah.
Great, thank you, Andy. There was a related comment, more than a question, that was made in one of my assigned readings when at HIU. I believe I read that the prayer Sarah lifted to God held Abraham to listen to her request and to do right by her. So I guess really the question is there how and this came up last week's presentation about, so how do we hold Abraham accountable in this situation, right?
Well, I think you're right. in the amount of time we haven't taken Abraham to task, and he is so guilty in these stories. He sells his wife. Sarai is raped in Egypt. He sells his wife in order to protect himself. He himself is worried about his survival and he's desperate, but his solution is to sell his wife, which our rabbis understand that in that interaction when Sarah and Abraham go down to Egypt in a famine, they leave with riches. I mean, so this is still biblical, Abraham is enriched by that process of selling his wife, essentially. And one of those riches is that after that is the first time we hear of Hagar. So it's in our rabbinic tradition that they make the connection that it is out of that encounter in Egypt where that Hagar is then given to them as part of their riches that come up back with them from Egypt. Abraham also, right in and around these chapters, in between these two moments, these family moments where Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar in Genesis 16, and then later in 21, in between is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham, before those two cities are destroyed, Abraham argues with God. It is this incredible lifted up moment where Abraham has the courage to take God to task for being willing to destroy these cities. Abraham says, what if there are innocent people? Would you really destroy, even though there are horrible and wicked things supposedly happening there, would you really destroy kill the innocent among with the guilty? And they go back and forth and back and forth. But Abraham has not one word to say in these moments between with Sarah and Hagar and Abraham himself, who is completely who is a willing and active party in this family dynamic.
I appreciate what Andi said. Obviously, again, in the Bible text that we use of the story of Abraham, that little thing switcheroo he tried to do in Egypt, our translation doesn't have that part that Sarah was actually violated, but that they found out in time and they were cursed and all of that. But it does tie into a little bit what Dr. Loudon said, and those two makes me wonder. We have been focusing on Hagar and Sarah, and Abram is like, where is he in all of this? And exactly what Andi just said in terms of him coming to negotiate for Sodom and Gomorrah, and yet for the woman who's pregnant with his own child, do with her what you want. I can get really upset at that, but it does tap into what Dr. Loudon said. Sarah had some authority. And again, if you look at the power dynamics in this story, which continue to be pervasive in our culture, how do women in the text utilize their own authority? The moment that Hagar tried, in the household of her mistress, that came to a quick end. But she went on to be revered in Islam, which says these women's stories, this particular story that we're looking at, might have downsides for a particular woman, but God is a God who sees each woman and is going to fulfill something in their lives. And I think that's the only reason why African Americans still hold to the faith, which has a lot of things in it that really rub us the wrong way. But our experience has shown us this same God. He's done stuff for us. This God is the one who sees us. Yeah, we know he sees the dominant culture, and they have claimed him for their own, but he sees us too. He is a God of the oppressed. And so we continue to lift up the stories, even though they're harsh and they're too close to reality for us. But we follow it to the end, and we find that God still prevails even for those who are on the underside of history.
Can I just mention, in terms of the Quran and how Abraham is seen, he's a good guy. I mean, in the Quran, he is the one who totally submits to God's will. And so in this whole story, the one who takes responsibility for this is God, in terms of, God tells Abraham, you need to do this. And it's not even between Sarah, it's not even Sarah's fault. It's not, it's God saying, do this. And Abraham is in total submission, in terms of, and so it's such a different angle in terms of how we see Abraham. It's really interesting to hear you all speak about him. But for us, he's like an exemplar of someone who believes in one God and submits to that one God. And so part of the Hajj is actually, it's called the Festival of the Sacrifice. Or what sacrifice are we talking about? We're talking about the time when Abraham was told to sacrifice his son, and because this ram was sort of in its place, it's like it's a blessing. He has proven himself, and now we are blessed. And so it's remembering that story as well. So it's really it's such an interesting thing to hear you guys have to say.
But let me just say also in that, in the Christian faith, aside from a woman's perspective, Abraham is very much lifted up. I mean, Paul uses him as an example of the just shall live by faith. He goes through Romans talking about the different stages in which Abraham is blessed because of his faithfulness, and that was a precursor for us to have faith, even when we cannot see what God is going to do. So he is very much revered. Exactly. He's, women might get upset with what he did to these two sisters, but in the Christian faith, he is still an anchor for our theology, understanding salvation and having faith and what is righteousness based on faith. So he is still an anchor to our faith, and our Christology goes back to him and then on to Adam. Absolutely.
So my favorite
also
bishop.
wanna-
Wait a second, Andy
Oh,
has something she wanted to add, please. Yeah, Andy, go ahead.
So I just wanted to basically second in Judaism as well what Barbara just said. Abraham is absolutely revered in the text, but I am hearing so one is that part of a feminist, not part of, the first step of a feminist, and I imagine a womanist reading of the text is deconstructing it and deconstructing.
That's correct.
It's unveiling the patriarchy that is embedded in the text, readings that we haven't always, looking at it, the text in ways we haven't always read it. And so some of that, just like Barbara said, is calling out, he did what? Why haven't we been angry about this for longer? And why have we been accepting that that's an okay thing in our society or way we're going to treat women? But a second point that I want to make, and I think is really, really an interesting one, Ida, between the ways that our two sacred texts function, is that in Torah, all of our heroes, all of our matriarchs and patriarchs are flawed, and there's no trying to hide their flaws. They have moments, just taking Abraham as an example here, right? He has this incredible moment before Sodom and Gomorrah, taking God to task and arguing for justice. And then he has all of these moments, these some other moments that we just talked about that shouldn't be ignored. And part of our way of connecting with the people about whom we tell our stories is being able to see ourselves honestly in them, that we too are flawed, and even our heroes that we revere are flawed, and we can learn from their mistakes, and we can also see ourselves reflected back, not just through what is righteous in us, but also what is flawed in us. And maybe that is also sacred and divine.
I find it really interesting that although we usually focus on Abraham, I think there are some new insights that we can gain from talking about Hagar and Sarah. I've already learned so much tonight, and we're nearly out of time, but I'm wondering if there's any other insights, Andy and Ida and Barbara, that you think we can gain from looking at our respective texts from the perspective of Hagar and Sarah, rather than, I think, the way we usually do, sort of from Abraham's perspective. Well, you already said.
Yeah, we did. Go ahead, Andy.
I have a question for you, Barbara, actually. Carla invited us, but it took me an extra minute to come up with it. And I suppose it's a little bit related as I'm trying to formulate my last thoughts. And I was thinking about this as you gave your presentation in the beginning. I'm wondering if in studying the biblical text and in relating to it, if you, as yourself, as clergy, as a womanist theologian, if you ever see yourself whether maybe it's outside of this particular story, if you see your story reflected in Sarah's at all. And I partially ask that question because our biblical stories are eternal, right? They are stories through which we see our own lives, through which we see subsequent histories, through which we relate through various identities that we hold. So they're not static, right? And how you explain as a woman as relating to Hagar and Sarah and Abraham as a result of that is one really important and beautiful way to relate to them. But I wonder also if they through that lens of that identity, if they stay statically there for you personally, or if there's other ways in, right? Because I'm super angry and frustrated with Abraham in certain parts of our text. And I'm also inspired by him and others. And so the last part of my question that I want to admit to is that, or that's behind the question, is that as I felt like I got to know Sarah more in my studying in school, when I came across, that going down to Egypt, it happens 2 times. The first time she is raped. It's not explicit in the text, but it's underneath the language. The second time is when it's stopped and she doesn't. And actually it's very clear to us that the reason that second story is there is to show that who the father is of Isaac. So that the text is clear that Abraham is Isaac's father. They need that to be completely, legitimate and for the inheritance and everything that will come next. But so once I saw that in the text, I was so horrified and pained for Sarah. And I also had a voice of a friend in my head who had recently talked about people who were abused then becoming abusers. And I saw Sarah in that light for the first time. And I was so sad for her, and I found more to her story than I had seen before, especially in the subsequent interactions with Hagar. But then as you're talking, and I think, well, if I'm imagining, I don't want to, as a white woman, I'm not gonna want hear stories of slave owners, men and women with their slaves, and identify myself with perhaps the oppressed wife of a slave owner who certainly does not have the status of a man in that society. But that doesn't, that's no excuse, right? That doesn't justify in any way any harm that she caused in the power and privilege she had in that relationship. So that's all behind that, my question, Barbara.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Andi. Let me say this. One of the things that I really embrace about a womanist perspective is that it gives room for more voices to be heard. And it doesn't just come and say, this is the womanist perspective, and this tops all the rest of the interpretations or understandings are mute at this point. No, it pushes through what has locked in the traditions historically and gives room for other interpretations from a cultural experience of the text. And so in being able to do that, it continues the revelation of the unfolding of Scripture in such a way that continued generations can own up to their ancestral mishaps and bad behavior and not feel condemned, and feel what's put upon their shoulders is to continue for continued light and truth. And so it's sort of like the resistance to critical race theory, because people are saying they don't want their children to feel guilty. If your children don't understand the past, they can't make a better future. And when you look at our young people today, they can look at that stuff. They're asking questions about how history has been perpetuated from the point of the oppressor or the conqueror. And so Andy, you're right. And for me too, let me say that what it means to me. I said I'm of a descendant of women who were domestics. But now I have somebody cleans my house, a white woman who cleans my house. How's my relationship with her? Okay. So how, so it's what have I learned? What have I learned? Not just pointing the finger, but it's how do I learn from when the situation is reversed and I am the person of status in any way? How do I respond to those who clean the office that I work at? How do I respond to people who don't have the advantages I have? Many times it was said quite well, the oppressed become the oppressors. And as women, and this goes back to what people say, as women, we have the call, we birth human life into this world, and we must make those kinds of different changes. And so you're right. It's how do we be very careful to not become that, and seeing in Sarah, not condemning her, but just being able to, as you say, deconstruct and look more critically at the text and say, hey, it is what it is, but at least put the pieces that have not been on the table there to understand, and still God is God.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Barbara.
Thank you.
I so appreciate the conversation that you all have been having between each other, that it's made this such a wonderful evening. We're basically out of time, and I was going to ask a last question, but I think what I'll open it up to any of you if you have any last thing you want to say before you finish, because your conversation with each other was so meaningful. You all feel that you've had your say?
I just want to say thank you to those of you who arranged this. I thank God for the exhibit that's causing us to think along these lines, Abraham out of one, many, and to get to talk with colleagues, my sisters in faith, in ways that I wouldn't know, I have not been able to, and I'm glad that we're doing more of us. 30 years ago, you would have been hard-pressed to find a female rabbi and a Muslim cleric to do this. And so I thank God for that. And that's a sign of hope. That's a sign of hope as we continue to talk and unravel the mystery of our sacred texts, and the mystery of a God who's still working with us. So I thank you for this opportunity.
Amen.
I totally agree. Thank you so much, Barbara, for those last words.
Thank you, Ida. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Barbara. This really has been fabulous. And we're so grateful you could be here tonight. And can we give them a round of applause? I know we can't really hear it, but we could see it.
Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being
Wonderful
with us
job,
this evening.
panelists.
We hope that you all enjoyed, I hope you all enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. This concludes the final session in the series of webinars around this art exhibit, Abraham out of one, many. And I hope you will get a chance to go view the exhibit at the Mandell JCC. It will be there until November 16th. So thank you all again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Good
Ida.
night.
Thank you,
Good night,
Andy.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Great to share this evening.
Bye. Lovely seeing you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.